Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, thank you very much. I think this has been an excellent conference. I certainly enjoyed it very much. We've been served a rich diet of satisfying intellectual fare. When I began to think about what I might say this afternoon, looking over the lectures we've had and so on, it seemed to me that pretty much everything that could be said had already been said. In fact, more than once, very often. I think there's been no harm in having a significant degree of overlap between different lectures, because you have the same topic being addressed from somewhat different perspectives, and that's helpful too. Now, you won't expect me, of course, to try and tramp over all that field again. What I'm going to try and do is pick out a few things that seem to me as having been particularly significant in what we've been told and thought about. I don't think that'll take me an enormously long time. I don't think I'm going to need the full hour. It's been allotted to me. So I'm going to indulge myself in the opening minutes by just giving you a couple of reminiscences of a figure who played an important role in our discussions on Friday morning, namely Fred Hoyle. When I was a young lecturer at the university here, I was a junior colleague of Fred in the Department of Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics. I think I have to say that Fred was a very difficult colleague. Fred exhibited in ordinary life, but something he also, I think, exhibited in his scientific life. But once he'd made up his mind about something, he became stubbornly, incorrigibly opinionated about it. It just wasn't a man easy to shift. My first reminiscence is being at a meeting in Dent. We had a new university position, and of course there were several large and active research groups in the department, and each group was represented to try and make its bid that this new person could go to its particular area. And I was there, of course, to represent particle physics, and Fred was there to speak for cosmology and general relativity. And Fred simply opened his bid, and this is all he said. He said, general relativity is the most fundamental part of physics. And it's sort of not something in a quantum series would naturally feel straight away it was right. It is the most fundamental part of physics, therefore this post should go to general relativity. End of argument. Well, that's what Fred thought was the end of the argument, but of course it wasn't the end of the argument. And in fact, the post didn't go to general relativity. And in fact, also I can say that the person who Fred was pushing for the post is someone who did not prove subsequently to have a particularly productive scientific career. So that was Fred in his way. The other thing I want to say about Fred is, Fred is one of these people, you do meet them, and they're very impressive when you meet them, who just are full of ideas. Ideas bubble out of their minds. And usually, of course, some of these ideas are good, some of them indeed are very good. But some of them are bad, some of them indeed are very bad. And those sort of people, those very creative, exuberant people, very often don't know which is which. My doctoral supervisor at the salon was another person of that sort of character, as it goes to being at St. John's College in Cambridge. But Adler's had a friend, Paul Matthews, who was both perceptive scientifically and also a strong character, who was able to act from time to time with Adler's scientific conscience. And to say to Adler, wait a minute, I mean, Adler has some wonderful ideas. He certainly deserved his share in the Nobel Prize for the electron weak theory. But Paul was able to act as a sort of extraneous person. But Paul never had, in his immediate neighborhood, somebody with that degree of both courage and persistence. And I think that was important. So, of course, though Fred had wonderful ideas, I absolutely agree with her suggesting the other day that he should have received a share in the Nobel Prize in nucleogenesis. I think it's a scandal that he didn't. But also, because he had some terribly bad ideas. Plagues coming from comets, Archaeopteryx, a forgery. And I can't help myself suspecting that one of the reasons the Nobel Committee didn't honour Fred was they didn't like this sort of accumulation of random bad ideas that were all suggested. So that's just a few reminiscences of Fred. But let's turn our attention now to the person who really this we're thinking about, who is, of course, Georges Lemaître. I've been very interested to learn a great deal more about Lemaître than I knew before I came to this conference. Of course, I knew a bit about it, but not very much. And of course, for those of us who work in this science and the religion world, Lemaître is an iconic figure. I mean, here we have a Roman Catholic priest, but also a great scientist, a truly great scientist, with creative ideas. It's very impressive and encouraging to see there. When I was thinking about what we were learning about Lemaître in that respect, I couldn't help feeling a comparison with another person of very deep Christian commitment who also had extremely important, informative scientific ideas, namely Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk. And the connection, of course, is that both Lemaître in his first paper, expanding the universe from Einstein's equations, and Mendel in his discoveries in genetics, published their results in obscure journals. And these results were not initially recognized and appreciated. It took Mendel, of course, much longer for his ideas to be recognized, in fact, eventually rediscovered and their significance assessed. So there's that sort of connection between those two, and I think they're both sort of iconic figures for those in that particular field. Another comparison that appeared to me when I was thinking about these things is also how even the greatest of people don't always get everything right. I didn't know anything about Mendel's, and Lemaître's theories about cosmic rays and their origin from the primeval atom. That was all news to me. And of course, it was clear that obviously that Lemaître regarded this as a very important support of his theory that he did this, and he was mistaken about that, as we all realize. Again, I couldn't help thinking of Galileo, who was, as we all know, believed that his theory of the tides, equally mistaken, his theory of the tides was a very important support to his support of the heliocentric system. So there are these connections in that sort of way. But of course, people do get things right. Another thing that struck me was interesting. We heard how both Einstein and Eddington both didn't like the cosmological constant being non-zero, didn't like the idea of a universe having a beginning in time. Both of which were ideas that, of course, embraced by Lemaître, and as it turns out, fruitfully embraced by Lemaître. Now, what about the theology of all this? Well, it is, of course, a commonplace in theological circles to emphasize that the doctrine of creation is not concerned with temporal origin. It is not concerned with how things began. It is concerned with ontological origin. Why do things exist? The question that the doctrine of creation is addressing is not who lit the blue text paper at the Big Bang, but why is there something rather than nothing, that fundamental question. My experience in talking around is that the world is divided into two halves. There are people to whom I'm one of them, to whom that question, why is there something rather than nothing, is a deep, fundamental, and important question. But there are a lot of people who can't see the point of this. And there we are. But that's what, of course, the doctrine of creation is about. And, of course, I was both pleased but not in the slightest degree surprised to learn that Lemaître, of course, recognized this and, in fact, had to press it upon Pope Pius XII to make sure the Pope didn't quite get out of line in respect to that. So I was, that's great. However, I couldn't help thinking a bit what we were told about how Lemaître expresses ideas in this respect, particularly in relation to the Pope, speaking of a Deus absconditus, of a hidden God. I thought that was a slightly dangerous phrase. Of course, the universe is full of objects labeled made by God, but a totally hidden God seems to be an overstatement of the case. Somebody was raised in the discussion, I think it was on Friday, the question of whether this was not getting dangerously close to that relationship between science and theology, which the embargo would classify as being independent, nothing really to say to each other in that sort of way, or Stephen Jay Gould's idea of known and non-overlapping phase theory. And I think that idea, I don't know whether Lemaître came that idea or not, but the idea is, I think, a dangerous and incorrect one. Of course, scientific questions are different from theological questions. We have every reason to believe the scientific questions will receive scientific answers. Equally, I think we have reason to believe the theological questions will receive theological answers for theological reasons. In that sense, there is a degree of independence between the two. But the two sets of answers, I mean, putting it rather crudely, in fact, really, if you say science is asking how things happen, the process of the world, and theology is asking the question of why things are happening, is there a meaning or purpose in what's going on? That's oversimplified, but if you use that, of course they're different questions, but the way you answer those two questions must bear some sort of consonant relationship to each other. My favourite, probably far too doggy and tired example, is the statement, on the one hand, the kettle is boiling because burning gas heats the water. On the other hand, the kettle is boiling because I want to make a cup of tea. I don't have to choose between those two answers. One's an answer in terms of process, the other's an answer in terms of purpose. They're both true of the same event. And if I'm truly to understand the mysterious event of the boiling kettle, I should have to ask and answer both of those questions. But the answers have to fit together. If I were to say to you, I've just put the kettle in the refrigerator and I'm about to make a cup of tea, you might think there was something funny in what was going on. So there is a relationship between what science has to tell us and what theology has to tell us. Science about the nature and history of the world in which we live. Theology is understanding that that world is a divine creation. There is a degree of influence between the two. And that's why those of us who work in the field of science and theology spend a lot of our time really trying exploring exactly those issues. The universe is, as just said, not limited objects made by God. But it would be very strange, I think, if there were no hints or rumours of God, no faint indications of the nature of the Creator reflected in the creation that God has brought and holds into being. They won't be demonstrable in a sort of unambiguous sense, but there will be some connection between the two, it seems to me. And I think that's that those of us who are keen on the revival in our own time of what is a revised, a strongly revised, but significant form of natural theology are very much trying to explore those connections. We don't any longer talk about proofs of God. We don't allege foolishly that atheists are stupid for not seeing things the way that we see them. But we do, I think, that atheists understand less and explain less than those who have a theistic belief. So there are these hints, rumours of deity, not giving us insight, but not affording us incontrovertible demonstration. One of the most important of those, I think, is just the intelligibility of the world in which we live. The discoverability of the world, if you like to sort of put it that way. I mean, it is very, very striking to me that science is possible in the deep way that it is possible. We can understand the workings of the world. Of course, obviously, evolutionary processes will have shaped our brains in such a way that we're able to make some sort of sense of everyday happenings. Otherwise, we would hardly be able to survive in the world. But how does it come about that Einstein was able to write down, fully formed really, on that amazing day in November 1950, the equations of general relativity? How Lemaître was able to come along later on and see that those equations imply the existence of an expanding universe, or had that as their possible implication. It's impossible to me to believe that these deep powers of probing the secrets of nature are simply a spin-off, a happy accidental spin-off from our ancestors having had to survive being chased by saber-toothed tigers. It seems to me that the deep intelligence of the world is a very striking fact about the world. And of course, as all of us here know, that fact is made even more mysterious and more striking by the fact that it is mathematics so often, which is the key to unlock the secrets of the physical universe. Okay, Lemaître's query obviously illustrates that very clearly. But after all, that makes it pretty abstract sort of subject. Our mathematical friends sit in their studies, out of their heads they dream up these beautiful patterns of pure mathematics. Nevertheless, it turns out some of these patterns are actually instinctive, actually occur in the structure of the world around us. So the reason within the mathematical thoughts of our minds, and the reason without the structure of the world around us, fit together in that sort of way. That's the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, as Drake's brother-in-law Law Eugene Bigger notably called it. And I think it would be incredibly intellectually lazy just to say, well, that's just a bit of good luck. It just happens to be that way. That's just a brute fact, if you like. A bit of good luck, you chaps are good at mathematics. I think that would be incredibly intellectually lazy. Now, of course, when you ask a deep question like, why is science possible? Why is fundamental science possible? Why is mathematics unreasonably effective? There won't be a knockdown answer to it. Again, I'm not saying that you don't see this my way, you're stupid. Not at all. But I am saying you may be missing something that's important. And of course, as a religious believer, I believe that within the reason I put together is to have a common origin in the mind of the Creator. And that the wonderful order of the world, that incidentally gives scientists not only the ability to understand the world, but the experience of wonder. That's the reward for all the weary labour of doing research and science. It's the occasional experience of wonder at the marvellous order found to be impressive on the universe. Our deep science, with the result of our mind. I would spell that mind with a capital M, the capital M mind of God behind the wonderful order of the world. So God is certainly not, of course, transparent. God is. I wouldn't call God a hidden God in an absolute sense. I would rather say that God's presence is veiled from us in this world. And I think it's also very obvious the fact that the more we've learned about the unfolding processes of the world in which we live, whether we're thinking about biological evolution here on Earth and its 3.5 billion year history, or thinking of the almost 14 billion year history of the universe, that unfolding history in which what starts initially simple evolves into rich complexity, that in itself influences the tone of our discourse about creation. We of course still speak of creation out of nothing, meaning by not of course that God takes some mysterious stuff called nihil and rolls it around to do something, but that nothing exists or remains in existence except through the will of God. We do that, but also the notion of continuous creation, the unfolding purpose of God in the creation order is a very important part of our understanding of the doctrine of creation these days. And we are able, in that way, to recognize that the God who is the creator of the world acts as much through natural processes as in any other way. The natural fruitfulness of the world is the expression of the will of its creator. That's I'm afraid something that our friends in the ID movement don't seem to be able to recognize. I mean, they don't say this explicitly, but clearly the hidden agenda is the feeling that if nature did it, somewhere or other God didn't have much of a hand in it. That's just a very bad theological mistake. God acts as much through nature as in any other way. And God brought into being a universe created with enormous potentiality. Potentiality is partly expressed by all these matters of fine-tuning that we've been rightly spending quite a lot of time thinking about in this conference. And those are expressions of the Creator's will. These things are significant, I think, not just a happy accident. Let me just say a word or two about fine-tuning. I agree with Don that theology can live with a multiverse, if that turns out to be the right idea, can live with a multiverse, just as it has been able to live, for example, would have been able to live rather, if the steady-state theory of cosmology had proved to be the right cosmological picture. I don't say that there will not be adjustments, and that, again, the tone of theological discourse in various ways will be modified by that. But I think it is perfectly possible to live with those things. It's not for us, in relation to the multiverse, it's not for us to eliminate, to lay down or restrict the divine creative generosity of the number of worlds that God is prepared to bring into being. That doesn't mean to say there aren't problems there, or theological problems. There are theological problems. What's the point of all those other worlds? Many of which, as far as we could see, have no fruitfulness or point at all. I think that would be a puzzling problem. Just as if you think about an eternal universe, it's altogether easy to see the point of all those infinite eons of time that precede the eon in which we ourselves live. There are puzzles there. But the multiverse is a possibility as an explanation of fine-tuning, just as, of course, a more theistic creation is a possibility. I want to agree with those who say this in this conference, that I see myself, in the present state of my understanding, the multiverse as being as much a metaphysical idea as is the idea of a world as a divine creation. My sort of generation of physicists, I worked in particle physics during the years in which the standard model got established. During those years, the theorists were continually being driven by experimental discoveries. There were very, very clever theorists around, of course, but nevertheless, the nudge of nature was always pushing us in unexpected directions. That's a pretty healthy state to be. But I think when someone comes along and tells you how clever and ingenious they are, and of course, the string theorists are some of them extraordinarily clever, extraordinarily ingenious, that they come along and tell you, they can tell you how nature behaves 16 orders of magnitude from anything in which we have direct empirical contact. That seems to me to be over-ambition. The lessons of history seem to me to suggest that nature might have something up her sleeve, certainly, or nature's creator might have something up the divine sleeve, which they haven't yet been able to think about. So I see multiverse at the present state as being a metaphysical, I guess, just as, of course, I say, belief in divine creator in that sense is a metaphysical gift as well. One more point I want to say about the multiverse. My friend and colleague, the late Anthropic, was much more warmly inclined towards the multiverse than you'll get out of I personally am inclined to be. And after I'd like to talk about it as being a means by which God could, I think I'm using the words correctly, explore the potentialities of the world. Well, with great respect, I think that was a mistaken way of thinking about it. God doesn't need to explore potentialities through experiments to see what happens with them. God knows those potentialities from the beginning. So I'm unsympathetic to that particular point. However, I think the main point at which cosmology actually challenges theological thinking is not about beginnings, but about endings. And I think insufficient attention in the theological world, anyway, has been paid to that. We all know that the stories that science has to tell, all of them, I think, really, in the end in ultimate futility. Whether it's that every human life is going to end in death. And as we know, and we've been thinking a little bit this conference, the universe itself is essentially going to die on a rather longer time scale than you and me. But eventually, it's going to die, most likely, of course, as we know, by continuing to expand, becoming increasingly colder and increasingly more dilute. But the certainty, one way or the other, that all carbon-based life will eventually disappear from everywhere it may be within this universe. Every story that science has to tell, every horizontal story of the unfolding of the natural process ends ultimately, it seems to be, in futility. Basically, I suppose, because of the thermodynamic, the irresistible thermodynamic drift towards disorder. And that's the only story to tell. I can perfectly understand how Steve Weinberg, with his atheist horizontal view, could say the more he understood the universe, the more it seemed to him to be pointless. Because there is to be, right? I mean, the science's horizontal story, which of course I want to take absolutely seriously, but it's not the only story to tell. Theology has a vertical story, as you might say, to tell of the continuing faithfulness of God. And if God is a faithful creator, then we have an expectation, both for ourselves and also, I believe, for the whole of creation, that the last word will not lie with death and futility, because the last word lies with God. And that there will be a transformation, a redemption of creation, and a resurrection of individual people, in which will continue God's creative purposes. I believe that God's creative purposes are intrinsically two-step. God brought into being this present world, which theologically I suppose we would follow St. Paul and call the old creation, brought this world into being as a world in which creatures should exist at some distance from the veiled presence of their Creator, allowed free, not overwhelmed, not finite creatures overwhelmed by the unveiled infinite presence of deity, but allowed the degree of freedom to be themselves and indeed to make themselves, which of course is the theological way of thinking about an evolving world. That world is a great good, and I think that's God's first purpose, but it doesn't exhaust God's creative purposes. I believe God's final purpose is to bring about a world which is transformed, that the old creation will be transformed into a new creation, into a world where semi-Atlantic drift to disorder no longer dominates. There will be such a new form of matter with such strong self-organizing principles that drift to disorder will no longer be the case. And that will be a world of a kind, in symbolic terms, envisaged in the 21st chapter of Revelation, speaking of a world in which there is no more death, neither mourning nor crying nor tears anymore. The former things have passed away. Behold, all things are made new. That's a belief which I think science can say nothing either for or against. It simply has a horizontal story itself. It cannot deny the possibility of a vertical story. But the possibility of that vertical story, in my view, depends upon the faithfulness of God. And of course, as a Christian, I believe that the transformation of the old creation and new creation has already begun within history with the seminal event of Christ's resurrection. His corpse was transformed into his risen and glorified body, leaving the tomb empty. That is the seed event, the seminal event, where the new creation has already begun to grow. These are important challenges of theological thinking, and I think that in the theological world, far too little attention has been paid to thinking about these things. Some of us in the science and the religion world have tried to do that a little bit. I've taken the liberty of mentioning two books. One is a book called The End of the World, The Ends of God, a symposium book edited by Michael Velker and myself, and with even greater modesty, mentioned a little book of my own called God of Hope and the End of the World. I did notice it's characteristic actually of the science and theology world generally. We need more participation from the theologians. Too much of the running is made basically by those of us who are what you might call scientists theologians. This formation is in science, and then we've moved into theological issues. Theologians have a very narrow view, I want to say, of reality. When they speak about the world, they usually mean planet Earth. And the vast universe is really out of their view. When they talk about the future, they usually mean the next 100,000 years of cultural history. They need to open their eyes a little bit and take rather longer horizons. And I think we must try and do what we can to help. Well, that's what I want, really, all I want to say. But I've got to end where I began, which is to say what a successful conference I think it would be. To express, I'm sure, on behalf of all of us, our thanks to the organisers, and also for all the people who spoke in this conference. Thank you.
Well, we do have some time for a few questions. I think yes. Questions, John? Yeah, I think so.
Comments, whatever. Yeah.
Comments, questions, please, yes.
Picking up this question of whether the multiverse is redundant because God didn't need to bother with everything else. We know that in mathematics things which are possible have a habit of actually coming into being. Think of Dirac thinking at the positron, and they go and look for it, and there it is. So could it be that when God thinks of other possible realities, because they're thinkable, they come into being, and that's what the multiverse is?
Well, that's an ingenious suggestion. I don't think God's thoughts are so uncontrolled as that. I don't think God starts thinking about, I don't know, a universe with enormously large cosmological constants. Oops, there's our point. God does what God wishes to do. That's, of course, one of the important things to remember in theological thinking. What we really mean by what we say when we say that God is almighty. We don't mean that God can do absolutely anything. What we do mean is that God can do whatever God wishes to do. God is not externally constrained by anything, but God is internally constrained by the divine nature itself. The rational God cannot decree, contradict God. The rational God cannot decree that 2 plus 2 equals 5.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So I have a related question to just that one.
No, God, you said that. I should hear you better.
Okay, a related question. I wonder what you would say to somebody who argued that, you know, in the past they could argue, well, when they didn't know there was other planets, for instance,
Yeah.
and say, well, what's the point of all this other stuff that's out there if there's, you know, a lot of dead planets and a lot of dead matter? But then,
Yeah.
you know, the current, you'd say, well, it was necessary because of the Big Bang
Yeah.
starting point, so maybe God used like an inflationary mechanism and it was just a consequence of that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. No, I see it. That's a possibility. I'm not temperamentally inclined towards the multiverse. I don't wish to rule it out for this limited reason.
I have a second question. No one else goes?
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it? Okay.
Yes.
The second one is,
Please.
the second one has to do with, you said, the doctrine of creation is about why is there something rather than nothing.
Right.
But then I think, you know, if some non-theist would hear that, the typical question there would be, but God doesn't answer that because God is something, so why does God exist instead of not God? So I wonder how would you address that?
Well, I would answer that by saying that if you ask that embarrassing child's question, who made God, which is, well, I'm putting that, you were asking that you haven't entirely understood what is the nature of God. Part of the nature of God is that God is self-sustaining, has being in himself. That is part of the definition of God. Now, that doesn't settle the question, which means, of course, that if God exists, then God exists necessarily. It doesn't answer the question whether God exists or not. And I would answer by saying something like this. I think in Western, first of all, I want to say, first of all, everybody has a metaphysics. Scientists very often say, well, I don't know, truck with metaphysics, I'm just a trainer, I want to scientist. But that's absurd. Everybody has a metaphysics. Because everybody has a world view. Somebody who tells you that there's nothing in the world except what science can tell you about, which is a message we've been hearing a little bit in the last few days, is taking a metaphysical view of life as anybody else. We think metaphysics as naturally and inevitably as we speak prose. You come to that. And in the Western tradition, I think it's fair to say that there have been basically two different metaphysical traditions. And they differ by what they take as their unexplained brute fact starting point. No metaphysical tradition can do without having some unexplained starting point. Nothing comes of nothing. And the two metaphysical traditions are, of course, first of all, materialism, which, if you like, takes the nature of matter, the laws of nature, as it's given brute fact, and believes in terms of those and explain everything else. That's what David Hume, I suppose, would encourage us to do. The other tradition is, of course, theism, whose brute fact, equally brute fact, is the assumption that the existence of a divine agent, the creator, and builds the explanation out of that. Now, I'm a theist and belong to that second tradition, because it seems to me the laws of nature, when we think about them, their deep intelligibility, their rational transparency, their rational beauty, their fine-tuned potentiality, have a character that doesn't make them very satisfactory as simply brute fact assumptions. They do seem to point beyond themselves. And I do find moderately sophisticated notion of the nature of God as a more satisfying initial assumption to make in that sort of way. But of course it's an assumption. I mean, nothing comes from nothing, as I say. So you have to bet on something.
No.
Yes, thank you very much, Sir John. I totally agree with your considerations, all, and especially the last ones. And I think that in the materialist tradition, the problem of the existence of something instead of nothing is generally due to the problem of if anything would exist, then the problem would simply be solved somehow. Because if anything exists, then we don't need to ask why something exists somehow. And I think that the manifold, at least some interpretations of the manifold interpretation of quantum mechanics, of the main universe, the multiverse, try to go into this direction, that is to solve the problem of contingency, if you like, in such a way. And I think this is actually possible, because one thing is the issue whether or not some physical laws or constants of nature could be different. Even if, as you know, I don't agree with the US theory. But this is, it makes sense to treat in this way. Another issue is if we can have any possible alternative events or happenings to those occurring in our world. I think that this is another kind of question, and I think that probably there is no solution of this problem. For instance, let's take quantum mechanics. I mean, quantum mechanics shows that you have a huge amount of correlations everywhere in the world. So if you will change an event here, this will affect a huge amount of other events elsewhere. So it is not so easy to understand why we should have other universe distancing any possible alternative events. You see my point? Because by changing one, you change a larger amount. So we will never have universes that are so similar to ours, but only differ in a single event. So you will have gaps in the sea of possibilities. You see what I was trying to say?
Well, for a point, yeah. So I think another way of, all the different ways of writing the history of science for the last 200 years. But I mean, one way would be to say that science has discovered exactly what you were referring to, the extraordinary interrelationality of the world. And we see it through quantum entanglement, obviously, see it in different ways through general relativity, where space-time and matter are intimately connected with each other, and so on and so on. And so that the atoms in the void, the simplicity of atoms in the void is dead and gone. We live in a world that's markedly interrelational. And you can't, as you play, you can't just tweak this a little bit, and that's it. I mean, that's one of the, when I think about, I mean, the most difficult theological problem, of course, is the problem of evil and suffering in the world. And when we think about that, I mean, let me just say a very simple thing about it. Well, it's a very deep problem. We all tend to think also that we've been in charge of creation. We don't know any better. We've kept all the nice things. Got rid of all the nasty things. Yes, the beauty and so on. Keep that, yes, seas and disasters like. More we understand how the world works, and science helps us to understand how the world works. More, of course, we realize these things are just interconnected. You can't have one without the other. There's a shadow side to everything. Genetic mutation produces new forms of life. Genetic mutation produces malignancy. You can't have the one without the other. And that it doesn't explain everything by living it, but relieve the anxiety and anger that we feel about the suffering of the world. And it does at least mean it's not simply gratuitous. That a creator was a bit more competent or a bit less callous could easily have eliminated. There's a false package deal in that creation, I think. The other thing I'd like, again, the interconnectedness of the world. Again, it's one of these sort of hints, I don't know. If take a Christian Trinitarian view of the nature of deity, that God is intrinsically relational in the divine nature, then it is not altogether surprising that there should be an intrinsic rationality palely reflecting that in the creation around us. I'm not saying for a minute, here's quantum entanglement, therefore doctrine of Trinity is true, that would certainly say, obviously. But I'm saying there is at least a degree of consonance between them, which is to me actually quite striking.
Intelligibility cannot be by chance. The intelligibility of all.
Well, I think it's an extraordinary intellectual intelligence to say, well, yes, good enough. That doesn't seem to me intellectually satisfying.
Thank you. Please. Yes.
Yeah, that's all.
As usual.
I have a couple of general theological questions.
So,
just to discuss, because I think the whole discussion misses these 2 points. First of all, it's a question on the fall. Because I mean, if we're serious on the fall, I mean, if we're serious about theology, we must accept that our understanding of the universe and the whole cosmology and scientific enterprise is going on in the state of the consciousness which is subject to the fall, which means that all predication about the beginning of the universe as creates or creates ex nihilo is corroded by definition, because I mean the state of our vision of the universe after the fall and state of our supposed vision of the universe before the fall is different, because we are not redeemed, we are not transfigured, we are not deified yet. So as an ultimate goal of deification, we can overcome this problem, but still, from a theological point of view, and this is my first question, can we really hope to uncover the mystery of creatio ex nihilo, or even asymptotically approaching cosmology to this mystery, if we know by default that our consciousness cannot grasp the ultimate sense of this world in the state of fall? It's question number one. And question number two.
not just for part of that, all right, okay, question number one. Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, I agree, of course, we have to have a realistic view of our powers of comprehension. We have to take very seriously the warnings of apoplectic theology, which have been more heeded in the Eastern Church, if I say so, than the rationally confident Latin Church of the West, which most of us here are the heirs of in one way or another. So there is a mystery. Equally, of course, the mystery card is the last card to play in theological investigation. As far as the fall is concerned, of course we don't think of the fall the same way that Augustine thought and Paul did. We don't think it is a disaster, single disaster of ancestral effect. This is marred the whole of creation. That there was no death in the world, or thistles or thorns before. What I think happened, well, the way I think about the fall, is that at some stage of hominid development, our ancestors acquired what I think is a distinctively hominid property of self-consciousness. Our animal cousins are of course conscious, but I think they live in the near present. The chimpanzee can figure out throughout the stick, maybe the water falls down. The chimpanzee, I don't think, sits there thinking, 20 years, I'm going to be dead. But we can, and we do think that. So we became self-conscious in that sense. It's possible to think how it happened, but it always did happen. It wasn't a single event. It must have been some process. At the same time, I think our ancestors became self-conscious. They also became God-conscious in a new way. Again, not only the animals are aware of the presence of the creation, but we are fitfully able to do that. And again, as a process, somehow there was a turning away from God, the pole of God, into the pole of itself. We became curved in upon ourselves, as Luther said. I think that's the fall. It's a process in which we are still the heirs. The essential nature of sin is the refusal to accept that we are creatures. We believe we can do it our way. That didn't, of course, bring death into the world in a biological sense. It probably there for millions of years before. It did, I think, bring into existence what you might call mortality, by which I mean human sadness at the perceived transience of life. And though it would be absurdly anachronistic, suppose that in Romans 5, that's what Paul had in his mind when talking about death coming to the world through one man, then the second Adam delivering us from that. Nevertheless, I think we can reinterpret Scripture. I don't think the Scripture for any has a single meaning. It has great depth and variety of meaning. We can reinterpret it as Christ being that link the human will be divine, by which our severed relationship with our Creator is restored. That's very obvious. Next question.
Thank you. I mean, from your comment, can I just make one inference? Can we say that all cosmology in this apophatic by definition, that cosmology effectively tells us what is the universe is not? We need to have cosmology, because at least in our knowledge of cosmology, we clearly understand that we are not entirely dealing with the universe as it was before the fall, as it was created in the mind of God, as it was destined to Adam and Eve. In other words, we have an asymptotic, infinite process of approximation of the universe as creation.
I think that's your what human knowledge. It's a sort of I believe in a sort of conversion of realism. If you never get there. Yeah. That's what I'm
all right. Okay. And the second thing is about Christ, about the essence of incarnation. Because what I realized that if you're standing on a theological position, you can't talk about creatio ex nihilo and creation in general without the access of incarnation, redemption, resurrection, ascension, and so on. In this sense, the incarnation becomes, if we, in particular, we take the point on Torahs into view, incarnation becomes extremely important because you need a body. You need a body in the universe, which means that all sets of anthropic arguments which people are using, they can be effectively, from a theological point of view, replaced by a Christological argument that we need the universe in order to have human body, and in order for the Logos of God, the second person of the Trinity, to be incarnate in this. In this sense, the whole universe has a constructed development in order to have this body, but after the incarnation, what is happening to the universe, we strictly speaking don't know on theological grounds.
Well, I think it's intrinsically human beings that we are embodied. We're not apprentice angels. That's why I find persuasive that the Christian hope is resurrection, not survival, in that respect. And that's why I think that the ultimate destiny is life in the world of the new creation. So not in some heavenly, purely spiritual world. And that's relevant what you're saying. That's forced me to pop up in my mind.
Okay. Yeah.
What you're saying again, very good about evil and suffering. You could say, well, all right, maybe we would throw it out, but then we have to take the package deal. We can't accept one without the other.
Right.
Now it seems to me it would be logically possible for God to just keep all the good perceptions, all the good things, and throw out the other. But then, of course, you'd have a universe very far from following any elegant laws of physics. So it raises the question in my mind, since it seems logically possible that we could just have the good, what we think of the good, without that, but we wouldn't then have elegant laws of physics. It makes me wonder whether, does God really have a high value for the elegant laws, and he many times preserves that, even when it does have the cost of people dying from cancer, tsunamis, and so on.
Well, I think I rephrase what you're saying, perhaps in a slightly pointed way, saying, of course, if we had lived in a magic world, then the creator of that world could ensure that every time we put our hand in the flame, the fire didn't burn us.
Right.
But we don't live in a magic world because our creator is not a capricious magician. Again, I'm back to God can do what is in accordance with God's nature. And so that's what so there might be, there is a sort of inner logic to magic, if you like. It's not God's logic.
But maybe the question is, what would you say would be the fundamental value of God to say that he prefers not to be a magician, even if being a magician would eliminate all human suffering?
Well, I think you have to ask God that at the end of the day. But to me, it seems that the sort of integrity of the divine nature is prejudiced by capriciousness of a magician, or would be. By capriciousness of a magician.
Actually, we have a question here first, and then we'll go on.
Yes.
We heard pi is something you can express in infinite series in pure mathematical terms, and yet when it comes to the four-color problem or Fermat's theorem, it wasn't actually known until quite recently what the actual numbers were, and they were the integer solutions we're looking for. Whereas these physical constants we heard described as contingent, but is there in fact a strict divide between the two? In fact, you know, is your opinion that in fact there might eventually be some series that would deliver the numbers of that nature?
Well, this is back to this question of whether there is some fundamental theory that uniquely fixes everything. There's no pre-parameters. Of course, it's one of the ironies of recent physics that people started off with the string theory, thinking the string theory was going to be just that sort of theory, and now they've ended up with 10 to the 500 different possibilities to choose from. But even if that was so, I think as somebody said, I think Bernard said actually, that if there is only one set of fundamental constants, it is certainly extraordinary that set derived from questions about consistency of general relativity of quantum theory and something also turns out to guarantee the existence of complex conscious being. That seems to me the most remarkable coincidence of any.
There's a question about that, please, yes.
You seem to be content to say that the theology of the end time, the wrapping up of creation, what's in Revelation and elsewhere, that theology and cosmology couldn't really relate. You put your finger hand up that and the other. Is that the case? Is that what you think?
Well, they do relate in the sense that I believe that the new creation is not God wiping the slate clean, having a second go and trying to do better the second time than God did the first time. The new creation is the transformation of the old creation. The FE2, I think, tells us that. So the new creation is not a second go ex nihilo, it's a creation ex vettere out of the old. It's a transformation. And to me, a very important scriptural passage is in Colossians 1, talking about the cosmic significance of Christ. That's an extraordinary passage, really, to written about him out of it, alive only a few tens of years before.
You know how 2 Peter will talk about it all ending in flames, so to speak.
I'm not a great lover of 2 Peter. I think it was a mistake that it was put into the canon. I would say so.
This was true.
That's the coin phrase.
There's a whole translationist view there as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
My question was just kind of along the same lines. If science have anything to say about resurrection and the new creation, and theologians needing to become more engaged with scientific ideas, how can we explore that in a scientific way, or is it just not possible to explore that scientifically?
Well, obviously we can't. I mean, obviously, the new creation is not something that is accessible simply through scientific thinking. But when you start, this is what I'm thinking for two books I mentioned. When you start thinking about coherence of the idea of a new creation or a destiny beyond death, you begin to see that you have, if it's to make sense, you have to satisfy two criteria. One is a criterion of continuity, the other of discontinuity. In other words, if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are to live again in the kingdom of God, it really must be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to live again, not new characters given the old names for old time's sake. So you have to have some sort of continuity that leads you on to asking questions like, what is the soul, going to play that role, and so on and so on. Particularly, of course, you must have discontinuity. I mean, there's no point in making Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob again live again, or to die again. So you have this dialectic between continuity and discontinuity. That isn't settled by science, but it places, I think, some degree of constraint while I'm thinking about it. And I say these books, that's things explored in some detail. I'm probably too late to try and do that in a couple of minutes at the moment, but that's an important point.
Well, we have 2 more minutes. I mean, the last question. Are we there? Okay, I think we'll draw to close. I think people, I know, have to go and catch planes and trains and we have to sit out. But let's thank John Polkinghorne very much.